Mom leaned in her perfume thick and sharp like she'd sprayed it just to claim the space between us. "You know we're still your parents," she said, her voice smooth but with a blade underneath. "And parents have a way of making sure what's in the family stays in the family." I didn't answer. I just set my coffee cup down on the table, the ceramic tapping once against the wood, because in exactly 2 minutes, Grandma's lawyer would walk in, and they'd wish they'd stayed away. Thanksgiving used to mean Grandma's house, the smell of cinnamon rolls drifting down the hallway, the creak of her old mahogany floors, and that faint hum she made when she watered her plants in the sunroom. This year, the house was silent. Too silent. Grandma was gone. She'd passed away quietly in her sleep 2 weeks earlier. No pain, no drama, just gone. And somehow, despite her wealth, despite the whispers from neighbors about old money and Hartwell shares, there had been no family around her bed in the final days. No one except me. That's because my so-called family had left me behind a decade ago. I was 15 when it happened. One morning, my clothes were stacked on the porch in a cardboard box, a folded note taped to the top. "We can't do this anymore." No explanation, no goodbye. Just the sound of the front door closing behind me as I stood on the sidewalk. I lived with Evelyn after that. She became my home, my mentor, my shield against the world. She never asked why they did it, and I never told her how many nights I'd wished she'd been my mother instead. So when the funeral ended and her lawyer called me into a private meeting, my stomach tightened. He told me there was a will, but not the one anyone else knew about. A second will. One that left everything her house, her holdings and her controlling shares in Hartwell Capital and Trust, to me. That was the moment they came back. They didn't call first. They didn't send flowers. They just pulled up the gravel driveway in a silver SUV like they'd been circling the block waiting for her to die. Mom stepped out first, wearing a navy blazer so sharp it looked like it could cut glass. Her hair was pulled back so tightly it erased any softness from her face. Dad followed, still in sunglasses, despite the overcast sky, his hands in his coat pockets, like he owned the place. They didn't say sorry. They didn't say, "We missed you." Mom just smirked and said, "We heard there's paperwork. You should remember your grandmother's assets were part of the Hartwell family portfolio, and in this family, assets are managed together." Her tone was all sugar, but I could feel the steel hidden in it. I didn't flinch. I let my eyes drift to the empty armchair by the window, Evelyn's chair, before turning back to them. "Funny," I said. "I thought family management required being present." Dad's jaw shifted a small tick I remembered from childhood arguments he thought he'd won. He opened his mouth to reply, but before a single word came out, the crunch of tires on gravel cut through the air. A sleek black sedan rolled to a stop behind their SUV. The back door opened and Mr. Langford Evelyn's lawyer stepped out, his leather briefcase in hand. And for the first time that morning, my parents' confidence faltered. They didn't know yet. But in a few minutes, they'd wish they'd never walked through that door. 3 years earlier, the boardroom at Hartwell Capital smelled of rain-soaked wool and tension. The market was free-falling. We were burning through liquidity faster than the reports could update. I was 34 still, officially the junior partner, though I'd been quietly steering more decisions than half the directors in that room. That week, I slept under my desk twice. I answered calls at 3:17 a.m., eating almonds from a paper cup so my hands wouldn't shake during conference calls with Singapore. I took meetings in stairwells because the elevators had turned into rumor chambers. When the crisis passed, Richard Hartwell, my father, stood at a charity gala in a perfectly tailored tux and toasted our resilience. He never said my name. That night I learned 2 things. A Hartwell will let the house burn as long as their portrait stays clean. Silence buys time. Richard's authority had the texture of marble, smooth, cold, impossible to chip without the right tools. My mother Allison wore hers like a designer fragrance, expensive, invisible, but suffocating if you stood too close. Together they curated the family's public narrative for annual reports and society columns. One son, William, the visionary who left for tech ventures and only returned for photo ops. One daughter me, the dependable one, expected to fix messes, then disappear from the story. At 18, I believed the company was an inheritance worth protecting. By 29, I knew it was a machine that ran on loyalty and returned nothing you could spend. Jonathan Pierce entered my life at 24, the first outside counsel I ever trusted. In a hallway one afternoon, he'd told me, "You think you're on the inside, Maya, but they're already holding the door behind you." I didn't want to believe him. I do now. The real pivot point wasn't the market crash. It was the summer after. William had lost 7 figures in a startup collapse. The family's solution shift assets quietly from low-visibility accounts, mine. The shares I'd spent a decade building transferred for tax efficiency. I remember the morning clearly papers slid across the kitchen island next to the croissants like they were nothing. Family support Allison called it as if she were offering me a casserole. Your brother will rebuild and it comes back around. That's how we survive. I signed nothing. I left the papers on the marble and walked out. But I understood the shape of their plan. From then on, my strategy changed. I stopped correcting their version of events in public. I stopped reacting when William smirked at my little projects. I started moving pieces quietly, legally, precisely into places they'd never think to look. Every check I signed went through 2 filters: necessity and exit strategy. I made allies who didn't wear the right cufflinks or have the right club memberships. I placed key documents under neutral custodianship people my parents didn't even know existed. And I began working closely with Evelyn, not just as her granddaughter, but as the one person she trusted with the truth. She showed me old trust documents, asset registries, even a clause in her personal holdings that allowed a complete transfer of control if current leadership engaged in misconduct. She never said she expected me to use it, but she did say this: if you want to understand power, don't watch who's speaking. Watch who's holding the records. From that summer on, I stopped being a player in their game and started designing my own board. Now, as I sat in that boardroom again, older, quieter, and far better armed, they thought they were watching a removal. They didn't see the shift in weight. And when weight shifts, balance follows. All this talk of structure, I said, eyes on Richard, but no one's mentioned accountability. He leaned back, his smile easy. That's built into the process. I shook my head. No, it's built into people. Or it isn't built at all. In my palm, the pendant's key pressed a small, sharp reminder against my skin proof that every move they'd made to cut me out had already been documented, secured, and placed beyond their reach. Votes only matter if the table still exists when you're done. The vote passed without ceremony, 6 in favor, 1 abstain. Mine. They didn't look at me when the hands went up. They looked at Richard. Even the abstention didn't register as a threat. That's the beauty of a long game if you do it right. No one recognizes it until the table legs buckle. Jonathan closed his folder slowly, like the clock wasn't running at all. Per the bylaws, we'll need the full transition files by end of day, he said evenly. Richard gave him a thin smile. Of course. Maya will cooperate. He said it like compliance was my native language, like obedience had been coded into my DNA. The conference room air felt over-filtered, dry enough that the lemon slice in my water looked brittle. I took a sip anyway, letting the pause stretch. The faint clink of glass on wood was the only sound. That won't be a problem, I said. I've been preparing for this transition for quite some time. Richard's brows lifted, just slightly polite surprise to the untrained eye, but I caught the flicker of unease. He was running the math in his head, trying to place the timeline I meant. I didn't give him the answer. I gave them the first crack. There's a secure deposit box at Northcrest Bank. Under my name, I continued. Jonathan has full clearance to retrieve it. Inside are the complete transition files and a set of records documenting asset movements tied to Hartwell Capital and Trust since 2019. A director on my left frowned. Movements. You mean standard reallocation. Some are standard, I said, meeting his gaze. Some involve the Hartwell Foundation. All are fully documented dates, amounts, routing details, the kind of records the auditors will want before the year closes. That was the first ripple. I saw it in the way two directors glanced at each other, in the way Allison's pen stilled in her hand. Richard leaned forward, forearms on the table. "Are you implying misconduct?" "I don't imply," I said, my tone flat. "I document." The room went still enough that I could hear the HVAC hum. Allison's voice cut through, steady but sharp. "This isn't the time for theatrics." "Maya, no, I said it's the time for records. Theatrics come later." Flashback summer 2019. My name buried in a ledger line item, a six-figure withdrawal I hadn't approved. 2 nights without sleep tracing it to a holding account in William's name. When I confronted Allison, she poured my coffee like we were discussing weather. "It's for your brother," she'd said. "He's in a difficult position." That day I learned my difficulty was never a variable in their equation. Back in the room, Richard straightened his tie, the smallest tell he had, when irritation threatened to surface. "You've had every opportunity here, Maya. Don't make this a spectacle." "I won't," I said, my voice quiet enough that they had to lean in to hear. "Spectacles are loud. This will be quiet." That was Mini Peak 1, the blade suspended mid-air. Jonathan slid his notebook shut. "We'll arrange the retrieval this afternoon," he said, already standing. Several directors shifted in their seats, caught between relief and curiosity. They'd just voted me out, but now they needed to know how much I knew, and how much of it could burn them too. I gathered my pen and the pendant from the table, feeling the cool press of the key inside against my palm. I didn't need to look at Richard to know his jaw had tightened again. Quiet exits are the ones people remember longest. The directors began to rise, collecting their papers and muttering about lunch meetings. I stayed seated. So did Richard, Allison, and Jonathan. When the last pair of shoes disappeared through the doorway, I slid a thick manila envelope across the table. "This," I said, "isn't part of the transition packet." Richard didn't reach for it. Allison did, nails clicking against the clasp before she pulled it open. Inside, 8 printed pages each, marked with yellow highlights and neat margin notes. She read the first line and froze. "It's a pattern," I said. 7 high-value transfers routed through 3 shell accounts. And here's the detail: the auditors will focus on 2 of those accounts linked directly to the Hartwell Foundation's operating budget. Jonathan's eyes didn't leave theirs. He'd reviewed every page with me 2 nights ago, cross-referenced with timestamps from Northcrest's archive system. Richard leaned back, folding his arms. "You think you can intimidate me with spreadsheets?" I met his gaze. "No. I'm going to replace the story you've been telling about me." He smirked. "And what story is that I let the pause stretch my tone, deliberate, unhurried, that I'm just a name on paper?" Then I leaned forward. "You think I'm just a name on paper?" A slow smile. "I was the paper." Flashback March 2020. I was in Northcrest's sub-level archive pulling quarterly compliance reports. The clerk, a man with ink-stained fingers, had studied my request list and said, "It's funny. Your signature shows up more often than Richard's. You've built half the deals in this company, even the ones they claim credit for." He'd been right. I had been the scaffolding holding their empire upright. Back in the boardroom, Allison's voice was a half-tone lower. "You're overestimating what you can do with a few files." Before I could answer, one of the directors, Ms. Calder, stepped back in, holding the door. "If those files are what I think they are," she said, "you'll have more than just the auditors to deal with. The Regulatory Commission will open a review, and no one here wants that in the papers." The air tightened. Richard's smirk faltered for the first time. He knew Calder was right. Public scrutiny would cut deeper than my vote ever could. I pushed my chair back, the legs scraping slowly against the marble. "You've spent years assuming I wouldn't speak, that I'd be the quiet one in the background while you staged the family photo." Richard's eyes narrowed. "So now you're the hero." "No," I said, standing. "I'm the historian, and historians don't erase. They record." Jonathan closed the envelope, sliding it back into his briefcase. "We'll see you at the vault retrieval, Maya." I walked out with him, the pendant key cold and heavy against my collarbone. Quiet power isn't about speaking louder. It's about controlling the record everyone else has to read from. The elevator ride to Northcrest's vault floor was silent except for the muted chime of passing numbers. Jonathan stood to my right, the manila envelope from the boardroom now secured inside his briefcase. At the final checkpoint, the security officer glanced at the form. Signature and key, Ms. Hartwell. I removed the pendant from around my neck, the small gold key swinging once before settling into my palm. My signature flowed onto the ledger directly under the column labeled Primary Asset Custodian. Evelyn had added my name to that line 6 years ago. The lock turned with a clean metallic click. Inside the vault, air was cool, dry, faintly metallic. Rows of numbered boxes lined the walls. Mine was 312. Jonathan lifted it onto the center table. When the lid came off, I didn't reach for the USB drives first. I reached for the leather ledger on top. Inside, Evelyn's handwriting was as precise as the day she'd taught me how to write a check at 16. Maya, if you're reading this, it means they've tried to take what's yours. Everything in this box is either in your name or protected by trust clauses they can't touch. There it was, certified copies of property deeds, original trust documents, and the clause from Evelyn's will granting immediate controlling interest in Hartwell Capital and trust to me if current leadership was found to have breached fiduciary duty supported by the documentation already in my possession. Jonathan skimmed the clause, nodding once. This is enforceable today. No delay, no court battle they'd lose on summary motion. The velvet pouch beneath the ledger held the rest 6 encrypted USB drives, each labeled with dates. They contained high-resolution recordings, board meetings, private planning sessions, even charity gala side conversations captured from Evelyn's own security system. Flashback. 6 months before she passed, Evelyn had handed me the pendant key. "I'm not giving you this to fight them," she'd said. "I'm giving it to you so you won't have to." By the time we returned to Hartwell Tower that afternoon, the vault's contents were cataloged, copied and backed up in 2 secure locations. The board reconvened for the quarterly review. I let them get through the performance reports before Jonathan set the briefcase on the table and clicked it open. "This," I said, sliding the ledger forward, "is the original record of transactions tied to Hartwell Capital and Trust and the Hartwell Foundation. It predates and contradicts several adjustments made under current leadership. No one reached for it. And here, I continued holding up the drives, is corroborating evidence time-stamped and authenticated, ready for both auditors and the Regulatory Commission. As per Evelyn Hartwell's will, these documents satisfy the conditions for an immediate leadership change. One director, Mr. Latham, spoke up. "You've confirmed authentication," Jonathan answered for me. "Northcrest's sealed chain of custody intact. It would survive any challenge. The silence that followed wasn't indecision, it was acceptance. The weight had already shifted." Allison finally broke it. "You're doing this to destroy us." I met her eyes. "No, I'm doing this so the company survives without you." Richard's stillness was calculated, but this time his calculations didn't matter. The vote to remove Richard as CEO and Allison as chair of the Hartwell Foundation took less than 20 minutes. Jonathan read the motion aloud, citing the clause from Evelyn's will and the evidence authenticated by Northcrest. With the majority of board members now focused on shielding themselves from regulatory fallout, the decision was unanimous. It was over before Richard even stood from his chair. By the time we walked out of the boardroom, the press release was already being drafted. Hartwell Capital and Trust announces leadership transition, effective immediately. The legal filings were submitted that same afternoon. My controlling interest secured through Evelyn's trust was formally recorded with the state within the hour. The Hartwell Foundation's accounts were frozen for audit pending my signature for release. 2 weeks later, I was back in Evelyn's study. The late afternoon light spilled across the desk she'd used for 40 years, highlighting the worn leather blotter and the small brass hook where the pendant key used to hang. The room still smelled faintly of her amber paper and the soft trace of gardenias. The ledger sat closed beside me. I didn't need to open it anymore. Jonathan had confirmed the last transfers that morning. Every property deed, every share certificate, every trust account was now in my name. I'd turned down every interview request. Let them speculate. Evelyn would have liked that. When I was 16, she'd told me, the loudest move you can make is silence if you've already set the stage for what happens next. Back then, I thought she meant patience. Now I understood she meant control. The next time I saw Richard and Allison was at a charity gala, the kind of event they once used to display the Hartwell legacy. They arrived late, avoiding the photographers. I was already on stage, thanking the guests for supporting the foundation's new transparency initiative. My words were measured, my tone calm. From the podium, I met Richard's eyes across the room. There was no anger, no fight, just the dull recognition of someone who finally understood he'd been outmaneuvered long before today. I closed with Evelyn's words printed in the margins of her ledger. You don't protect what's yours by asking permission. You protect it by knowing it's already yours. The applause filled the hall. I stepped down without looking back. Later that night, I stood on Evelyn's porch. The boards were cool under my bare feet. Beyond the hedges, the city hummed softly in the distance, but here it was quiet. I hung the pendant back on its hook. I didn't need to carry it anymore. I didn't leave because I was angry. I left because I'd already stepped into the place Evelyn had been keeping for me all along. No one called after me. And for the first time in my life, the silence wasn't theirs, it was mine. If you stayed until the end, maybe you saw a little of yourself in my story. Maybe you know what it feels like to be underestimated until you decide you're done. If you want more stories like this, subscribe. Not because I asked, but because you know you'll be back. And next time, I'll tell you how silence can be the loudest revenge.